Well, welcome everybody to this panel discussion. Thanks very much for giving up your time to be part of this. A lot of expertise in this room to help with this conversation. So welcome on behalf of Victoria University and on behalf of the Te Ringa Waka Centre for Justice Innovation. I hope many of you now know what that is. It's now well established here as a centre for research and cross-disciplinary work. We're looking at quite a number of areas at the moment, AVL links for court proceedings, this project on the effects on children who witness family harm, and our main project at the moment is looking at the custodial remand population. So, thanks for coming to this today. Can I just briefly introduce people who are involved in the panel? Myself, I'm John Walker. I'm a co-director of the Centre, alongside Professor Yvette Tinsley, who's also joined us today, and Everard Halbert, who's also a director. And we have two other panellists to present to us today and to share their expertise and knowledge on this topic. Dr. Kim McGregor, nearest to me on my right, the Chief Victims Advisor to Successive Governments, with a great depth of experience in understanding the effects on children who witness family harm. And Dr. Alana Oakly, who's a Principal Advisor, Outcomes and Insights, Te Puna Aonui, the collective approach of government and communities to tackling the ongoing problem of family violence in our country. She has data which will help us in our discussions today. I thank you both for being willing to be part of this today. So, why have I initiated this conversation and examination of the issue by the Centre? So, as many of you will know, I've been a youth court judge and a district court judge, I always hesitate to say this, for 30 years. And I have for a long time presided in specialist family violence courts. And in that time, I've seen daily repeated themes in the cases that have come before me. In the youth court, the young people come before the court with a myriad of factors contributing to their offending behaviour. Repeated exposure to family harm, the learning of behaviours, and the effects of that trauma is what I so often read about in the psychological reports, the social workers' reports, lay advocates' reports. Police statistics show that in a review of over 16,000 youth offender records between 2013 and 2016, 80% of offenders under the age of 17 had evidence of family violence in their homes. Old data, but I doubt if it's got any better. Police figures show that in 60% of police family violence call-outs, children are present or normally resident in the home. If we take the figure for police call-outs, family harm investigations, as 160,000 in a year, that's the figure that I'm remembering. It may not be the latest, but it won't have got less probably. That means that in 96,000 events, children are present. Often more than one child, of course. So that's a lot of children exposed to family harm every year across our country. And that's just what we know about, because when we take into account that only 20% of family harm is ever reported to police, that is a very large number of children exposed to family harm in their home. One issue for discussion today is, what are we doing for those children? To interrupt what appears to be their trajectory into repeating what they see and having exposure to family harm through its trauma contribute to later offending behaviour. In the district court, the cycle of family violence plays out again and again. This early exposure I read about, detailed in pre-sentence reports prepared by corrections. I read about it in mental health reports, and I read about it in cultural reports. Often when I see a defendant, particularly in family violence courts, pleading guilty to family harm, and the summary of facts tells me that children were present, in the conversation which I will have with a defendant, I will refer to that and say that I don't know whether it's usually his history or not, but that what I'm seeing in court is young people exposed to family harm ending up where he's standing today. You know, my experience of that is, even with the staunchest of defendants, that strikes a chord. Probably, highly likely, it is his story on the figures that we know about. So I'm on safe ground, I think, having that conversation. And I've seen defendants cry at the prospect of that, because they know that it is their story and that they are part of repeating it now, thinking about what they saw as children. So I've been a judge long enough to see the cycle play out in front of me for myself. Those I dealt with in the youth court when they were 15 or 16, appearing before me as 30-year-olds and older, charged with family violence offences. I know their story. Young women that I've seen in the youth court affected by trauma, I see now as the victims of family violence. When I do see in the police summary reference to children being present, that's become increasingly common, and I think it seems to be part of the template for doing a summary of facts. That is what the police are alleging happened. They tell me that the children were present during the violence. I often imagine these children when the police turn up at their home, often repeatedly, and as the police are paying attention to the perpetrator and the primary victims, I imagine them waving a red flag and asking, "What about me?" Well, what about them? That's the issue for this conversation. What would be the long-term benefits of paying attention to them? What could that look like? I'm not expecting that we will be able to design a response today. This is the start of the conversation, the start of us all collectively talking about this. This is not a courtroom issue. It's not a justice issue. It's not a police issue. Not Alana Tamariki, it's not corrections. It's across the board and including communities. So, kicking off the conversation. Can I now invite Dr. Kim McGregor to present to us. Kim, thanks very much.
Tēnā koutou, rangatira mā, ngā mihi ki a koutou, ko Waiaho, ko Glen Lyon Tamonga, ko Loctata Awa, ko NAC Te Waka, ko McGregor Te Iwi, ki McGregor Toka Wingoa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I'd like to mihi to you, Judge Walker, and really thank you for your leadership in this space. When I was first appointed to be the Chief Victims Advisor to Government, Minister Amy Adams sent me to your court, almost in my first week, to have a look at what a good community court might look like. I'm going to speak about, if I can get this thing to work. As Judge Walker has spoken about, silent victims, children, incubated in fear, tamariki, exposed to violence. First, for those of you who don't know me, I'm the inaugural Chief Victims Advisor to Government. I've been in the role for 9 years. The terms of reference for my role was to improve the justice system for victims in the criminal, civil, and youth justice systems. The role was a very small one, so it's a big terms of reference with a very small role. I started off as 0.3, so it's a day and a half a week. My role was modelled on the Chief Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, Sir Peter Gluckman at the time, and it was largely to be an academic role. So I provide independent, contestable advice to the Minister of Justice, and I've served 6 Ministers of Justice and several other justice sector ministers, including police, courts, children, family violence and sexual violence prevention. There is a Chief Victims Advisor website if any of you would like to look at the 16 reports that I've produced in the 8 years when I had a research budget. My background, however, is the reason I'm here today is being a therapist for over 30 years, working with adult and child survivors of interpersonal violence. And that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. So I want to talk about the difference in the trauma impact on, based on the type of trauma and violence that's experienced. And there's quite a distinction between interpersonal violence trauma and non-interpersonal violence trauma, the difference between trauma on adults and trauma with children, and whether that trauma is singular or is repetitive. So if we're talking about non-interpersonal trauma, the earthquake that you experienced in Wellington last weekend would have been a shared experience. You may have reached out to other people to find out how they coped with it. So you'd have a shared language. It's unlikely that you would have felt feelings of shame, guilt, self-blame, or betrayal. That's the difference with interpersonal violence. There is no shared experience, and there's very little talking about the abuse. There's also quite a different impact in trauma on tamariki compared with adults. And that's because children are developing. So when children are exposed to violence, it's at a time when they're developing cognitively, physically, emotionally, and it's a time when their trust and their views of their self and others and the world is being formed. It's also a time when they are dependent on their caregivers and their community. Children are essentially trapped in the environment that they're born into. So prolonged trauma differs from single episode of trauma. And when we have multiple interpersonal abuse, the context that these are likened to are hostage situations, are concentration camps, prisoners of war camps, sex trafficking, because the person who is harming you, is dominating you, is also responsible for the food and water and shelter that you have. So you are completely reliant on them to stay alive. And psychologists say that in these situations with ongoing child abuse, there's likely to be a macabre double bind that's created in the relationship between the person who harms them, who is sometimes protective and supportive, and sometimes is really dangerous. And this can produce feelings of love and hate, and also dependence and betrayal, all at the same time. So exposure to violence has the potential to alter all child attachment patterns from that moment on. And that's because harmers are mostly known and trusted. They're in the child's home or community. That's how people who harm get access to children, because they are trusted. They are in the home or community environment. So interpersonal violence disrupts a child's attachment patterns because it makes all human beings potentially dangerous. Most people who harm, at some point, are nice. It might be because they're grooming, but very often they are supportive and nice, giving presents. As I say, it might be grooming. But if children have witnessed nice people then turning into dangerous, violent people, how can a child know, even if they're nice people, maybe they're police, maybe they're social workers at school, school counsellors, teachers, they may be nice people, how do they know that those people will not turn into dangerous, violent people eventually? Because that's what they've witnessed. So it's difficult for children who are exposed to violence to form trusting relationships with people and form friendships. Some children will end up repeating the pattern of behaviour that they witness. Some will try and hurt others before they hurt them. Some will try to find powerful allies to protect them. And some will experience learned helplessness. Now, a state of trauma in an adult may dissipate over a period of time. A state of trauma in a child can become a characteristic, a trait. That's because a child's brain is malleable. It's like plastic. It can be shaped. Because a human brain has over 100 billion neurons to process experiences. And that's whether those experiences are nurturing or are traumatic. And it's the frequency of that experience that creates a processing template. And after the processing template is created, all new information will be processed through that template. So Bruce Perry talks about a state of traumatic fear in an adult can be internalized in a child and become a trait or a characteristic. So the child can become a withdrawn child, a frightened child, an angry child. So when children can't fight or flight, and we know that some children have run away, and if we look at the report into abuse in care, children have run away and sometimes they've been returned to the people who harm them. some of the children I worked with, other therapists, tried to fight the person who was sexually abusing them. When there are no options to fight or flee, all of us have a freeze response. Now, a freeze response is very much like a car with the accelerator fully on, flat to the floor, and at the same time, the brake is fully on, flat to the floor, at the same time. So there's revving, braking, right at the same time. That's a description of a freeze situation for a child. So on the surface, we may have a child that's a fairly blank appearance. Underneath, we've got this accelerator and brake happening, and that causes wear and tear on a child's body. When I had the opportunity to do some postdoctoral research on the physical health effects of childhood sexual abuse, I found elevated heart rates, cardiovascular problems increased in adulthood, cancers. And this all comes back to the wear and tear on a child's body. They have to be alert every single moment for the next time. When I talk to my clients about the experience of trauma, and this is usually sexual violence we were talking about, when they got to a therapist when they were like 20 years later, I talked about the experience that they witnessed of violence or trauma as contained in a time capsule in the amygdala part of their brain. And as I talked about the shared experience of the earthquake in Wellington at the beginning, if a child has had no opportunity to process that experience, that is held in a time capsule until there's a moment of safety, often later in life, when they can start to talk about that trauma. And when they start to talk about that trauma, very often they'll be flashed back, right back to that 5-year-old child. So through the child's development, there's likely to be a kindling process that's happening. And kindling is talking about the kindling wood that we put on a fire. If there are elements of reminiscence of the trauma that they experienced early on in life that's replicated, and I'm talking about a hierarchical situation where somebody's dominating them, there can be a really over-the-top reaction, and the child will not know, or the young person or the adult will not know why they have reacted that strongly, because it has not been processed yet. Now, most tamariki will not speak out about the abuse while it's happening. And I'm just going back to my PhD study, which was on women in Aotearoa who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. And they had experienced severe child sexual abuse ranging from genital contact through to rape at age 7. Only 4% spoke out about the abuse at the time it was happening. 53% took more than 10 years to tell anyone. And when they told, the people they told were not the police, not healthcare professionals, they were family and friends. And to begin with, they would only tell a very small piece of the violence or the trauma. And that is to test the reaction of the person who's listening. If there's an okay reaction, they will tell more. As soon as there's the risk of danger, anger, heightened emotion, they may withdraw their disclosure. And for children, it's very common for them to disclose the abuse at some time when they have a safe moment or speaking to someone they feel is safe. And then if there's a reaction from the family, they may retract. And then later on down the track, when they are safe again, they may then disclose again. So this means we as adults, we need to take responsibility, and we need to make tamariki safe when we suspect abuse. So why don't children tell? There's a lot of loyalty to their family. There's protecting their family and often the harmer, because the people who harm, they often love. There's fear of the harmer and what they will do, and many people who harm have threatened to harm their mother, their siblings, them, their pets. So there's a fear of what might happen. Many children expect to be blamed. And I remember when I did Child Development 101, I remember hearing that very small children believe that they are responsible for everything. So small children actually believe that the sun follows them when they can see their shadow. So when mum and dad argue, they feel responsible. They might have wet their bed, mum and dad get angry, mum is beaten up. Their fault. So they don't tell. They may be embarrassed. They may not want to upset others. And I've spoken to many clients, one whose mother had cancer. She was dealing with so much. This woman wouldn't tell her mother that her grandfather was raping her almost every night. They don't want their families to split up. They don't want their siblings to be taken away. They don't want to be taken away. So this is some words from adult children who experience violence, that the impact of violence, it stopped, but the damage had been done. I became a frightened, clingy child. My childhood was shattered. I was no longer safe anywhere. Fear filled my every waking moment, waiting for the next time. I lost my joy, my spontaneity, my innocence, and my trust in anyone. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Alana, who's going to talk about evidence and data from Te Puna Aonui.
Thanks, Kim. And Kim will come back after I talk about solutions. So we'll end on sort of a more positive note, hopefully. So kia ora koutou. My name's Alana. I work at Te Puna Aonui Business Unit. And because I always have to explain my job and where I work, I've got quite used to it. So Te Puna Aonui is a collective of 9 government agencies. You'll see them up there. The idea is there's an executive board with the CEs of these 9 agencies to try get all of these agencies working together to align the way the government works to eliminate family violence and sexual violence rather than in a siloed way. And one of the main roles of Te Puna Aonui is to implement Te Arere Kura, which is New Zealand's national strategy to eliminate family violence and sexual violence. So this was published in December 2021. It sets out a collective 25-year pathway to eliminate family violence and sexual violence, and you can see there the overall vision for Te Arere Kura, which is that all people in New Zealand are thriving and supported to live their lives free from family violence and sexual violence. So Te Arere Kura recognises that there's not a simple solution to eliminating family violence and sexual violence. It's a really complex problem. And so it outlines these 6 key changes required to eliminate family violence and sexual violence. And that includes not only having better responses to violence when it happens, but also increasing primary prevention to stop violence before it happens, having better healing. So for people who, as Kim mentioned, don't disclose until 10 years after, what do we do for those people as well? And this is sort of underpinned by having sort of increasing the number and capability of workforces, mobilising communities to implement their own solutions, having better strength-based approaches by government, so government doesn't contribute to harm. And this is sort of underpinned by also having better data and research. So I'll talk a little bit about the data and research we do have around children exposed to violence. So I'll start off by defining exposure to family violence. So family violence itself is a pattern of behaviour that coerces, controls or harms within the context of close personal relationships. So a lot of people focus on just physical family violence, but it's much bigger than that. There's also sexual violence, as Kim outlined, as well as coercive control, psychological violence and economic abuse, for example. But there's also lots of different types of violence that look different in different types of communities. And family violence includes children and young people being exposed to violence between adults. So I'm using the term exposure rather than just witnessing because it's much wider than just witnessing, even though, as you'll note when I talk about the research, a lot of the research does focus purely on witnessing physical intimate partner violence between adults, for example. But if we were taking a broader definition would include not just seeing, but also trying to stop it happening and experiencing the aftermath. So a parent, for example, if a parent dies by family violent homicide, physical injuries, damage to property. And there I've put, this is a little bit of an old estimate now, but in 2014 there was a estimate of the economic cost of family violence overall, and that was around $7 billion per year. It's probably a lot higher now. And if you look at the estimate that is attributable to children, that's around $1.12 billion. So to sort of visualise this, in the centre here we've got people who experience violence directly themselves, so children who are the victims of abuse or neglect, or adult victims of intimate partner violence. I've written who have children there because this is relevant to children, but obviously people can experience intimate partner violence even if they don't have children. And I'll give an overview of data for those people first before we sort of target on children exposed to violence. But you might have heard that 1 in 3 women will experience intimate partner violence in their lives in New Zealand. And that's true, but it's specifically relating to physical and sexual intimate partner violence. If we include psychological violence, controlling behaviours and economic abuse, that increases to 1 in 2 women in their lives. And while there are men who experience intimate partner violence as well, women tend to experience more types of violence. The severity is much higher and the frequency is much higher as well. And for children who are victims of abuse or neglect, around 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 12 boys have experienced sexual violence by the time they're teenagers, and 1 in 10 children and young people have been physically abused by an adult at home in the past year. So there's a huge overlap here as well between children who are exposed to family violence and those who experience it themselves. So given that the presence of violence in the home means the risk of experiencing violence targeted toward the child is much higher as well, and that's around 70% approximately of children experiencing physical abuse when there's family violence happening in the home. And while these categories aren't discrete, I'm specifically going to talk mostly about children exposed to family violence. So a big problem with our data is that we don't measure children exposed to family violence very well. So one thing is that sometimes we'll ask parents, have your children been exposed to family violence? But they often don't know. They think their children haven't or are not aware, but they often are. Sometimes we ask children and young people themselves, but usually we're just asking about physical intimate partner violence. So in 2021, there was a youth health and wellbeing survey called What About Me? And they asked a lot of different things of children and young people between 12 and 18 who are mainly at high school, but it also asked questions to some children who are in alternative education or not in education, and it asked if they had witnessed physical violence between the adults in their home in the past year, or physical violence between an adult toward a child in their home in the past year. And that was around 3% of reporting that they had witnessed adults physically hurting one another in their home, and 5% saying they had witnessed an adult hurting another child in the home in the past year. And this was higher both for rangatahi Māori and Pacific children and young people. And this is likely a huge underestimate because it's only talking about physical intimate partner violence. It's only talking about witnessing rather than those other types of exposure. And it's also not considering other types of abuse that might be specific to different communities. For example, with ethnic communities, witnessing things like visa abuse and dowry abuse, those wouldn't be included here. So this is likely a huge underestimate. Judge Walker mentioned this one before. Around 60% of family violence investigations undertaken by police have children present or normally resident in the home, and this was from 2017, but it's probably not too dissimilar now. And this is of the 187 family violence homicides that occurred between 2009 and 2019. There are around 500 surviving children of those family violence homicides. So I'm just going to briefly touch on adverse childhood experiences, which you may have heard of. So this ties in really well with what Kim was talking about. So these are potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood. So, for example, experiencing violence, abuse or neglect, but also exposure to violence. And other ACEs, which might be all interrelated, include experiencing a family member attempt or die by suicide and growing up in an unstable home. And that can include parental separation, parent being in jail, and things like that. And those can all be interlinked. And ACEs affect brain development, the immune system, and the cardiovascular system, as Kim was mentioning. So the more ACEs that a child experiences, the higher the risk of them experiencing these different outcomes. So that can include things like heart disease and cancer, mental distress, but also behaviours like smoking and heavy drinking, and experiencing or using intimate partner violence. So if we look at specifically the impacts of exposure to family violence on children and young people, so even when children and young people are not subject to abuse or neglect themselves, they can be harmed by exposure of it happening within their household or wider family. So harms from exposure can include developing or experiencing emotional and developmental difficulties, and what this looks like will be different in each child, and they can have there's different sort of pathways. So there can be internalizing behaviours, things like depression and anxiety, things that happen inside, or externalizing behaviours like things that would be commonly referred to as lashing out, like hitting or punching, and internalizing behaviours are more common for girls, and externalizing behaviours are more common for boys. That doesn't mean that they will definitely happen, but that just the risk is higher. And if we look at specifically some New Zealand research on this, so this combined both children and young people who are exposed to violence as well as children and young people who experienced violence themselves. So this was the Youth 2000s surveys, which were the child and youth health and wellbeing study that happened before the most recent one I talked about. So these kids are more likely to be bullied, experience sexual abuse, experiencing internalizing behaviours like attempting suicide and having depression, and externalizing behaviours like attacking somebody with a weapon. And these were a bit different depending on the gender of the child. And so if we see over the left here for girls, depression was much higher. Basically exposure to violence increased likelihood of all of these things happening. But for girls, there was a much greater impact on depression and attempting suicide. Physically harming someone on purpose was quite similar, but the impact from not exposed to violence was much higher for girls, and attacking somebody with a weapon that had a bigger impact for boys. So there's also a huge intergenerational effect of violence, of exposure to violence. So girls exposed to violence in childhood are more likely to become victims of violence when they're adults, and boys exposed to violence in childhood are more likely to use violence as adults. And if a child is exposed to violence, when they grow up and if they have their own children, their children are more likely to experience school difficulties. So they're 3.7 times more likely to be truant, and 2.8% more likely to have at least one difficulty at school. So that sort of shows the longevity of just exposure to violence and its long-term impacts. And this is my last slide. There is also a real gap in services available for those children. So a lot of the services we have that are for children are specifically for children who experience abuse or neglect themselves. So in 2017, the former Social Policy Research Unit, I think that's what it was called, Superu, did a study on what works for children exposed to family violence, and they found 30% of children who are exposed to family violence did not receive adequate support services. And that was often because they didn't meet the criteria, and as far as I'm aware, this hasn't changed too much. And the Family Violence Death Review Committee, in their 2023 report, which I think was their 8th report, found of those, before I mentioned there was 500 children who were survivors of family violence homicide, most of them did not receive government support, and that was because they did not meet criteria. So there are no specifically targeted services for children who are just exposed, as opposed to children who experience experience violence and neglect themselves. So I'm going to pass back to Kim now to talk about what we can do. And this will feed into our discussion at the end. So, yeah, thanks.
I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up for discussion. And I know we've got some great experts in the room, so I'm looking forward to that discussion. So what can we do about this situation? We know that the context is family violence, and it's mostly violence against women. A World Health Organization study of 161 countries found that nearly 1 in 3 women had been subject to physical and or sexual violence by an intimate partner or non-partner sexual violence, or both. This is a worldwide problem. And globally, nearly 40% of all murders of women are committed by intimate partners. Professor Janet Farnslow, just a week or so ago, put out a opinion piece, and she said that men also experience violence, but their patterns are different. Men are more likely to experience violence from other men, which takes a toll in terms of injury. For the majority of men who experience violence by intimate partners, the violence they experience is not as frequent or severe and is less likely to result in fear. However, we also must remember that a huge number of our boys and young men experience sexual violence as well. And Janet was saying that, as Judge Walker said right at the beginning, violence is more than a justice issue. Violence and trauma are costing our healthcare system between $4 and $7 billion each year. And if we don't start seeing violence as more than a justice issue, that crippling burden will only worsen. So we know that adverse childhood experiences and their risks are preventable. And they can be prevented, and we can reduce many of the health, mental health, and social injustice consequences. We know that a number of parents who've experienced abuse themselves go on to be protective, caring parents, protecting their children from future abuse. What we need to do is to prevent adverse childhood experiences, is to support the expansion of these safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments for all tamariki by supporting their whānau, parents and caregivers, especially those parents, caregivers, whānau, who are burdened by dealing with their own experiences of family violence and sexual violence and poverty and racism and the ongoing impact of colonisation, which includes the over-incarceration of Māori, and particularly Māori wahine, who are dealing with intergenerational abuse and abuse in state and faith-based care, who are dealing with disabilities and inequities. So I looked up the Centre for Disease Control, and they have 5 known strategies to prevent adverse childhood experiences. And this is to support communities, to strengthen the economic supports for families and whānau, to ease the stress. We don't want mums and dads to be working 2 to 3 jobs each to be able to support their children. We need to support parents with life skills. Those children who've experienced abuse, who missed out on education, we need to be able to teach life skills. We need affordable, quality childcare and education in early life, including really quality, affordable after-school activities. We need to enhance parenting skills to be able to promote healthy child development. And really importantly, we need to intervene to lessen the harms and prevent future risk. So I'm going to repeat myself. Intervening to stop violence, children need adults to act for them. We need prevention of violence at multiple levels, primary, secondary, tertiary levels. We need ongoing education of all people in all places where children are so that they can see the harm and act to protect. We need to train all teachers, all healthcare professionals, and we've got a VIP, we've got a violence intervention protection process. Help me out here. Program, thank you. To identify and safely respond to indicators of abuse and to know how to refer. And we need to have the backup, all of those services to be able to back up our teachers and our healthcare professionals, because they can't identify abuse and then be left with it. We need to listen to our tamariki and our children, and we need to act on their behalf. And we've heard that even very young children tell us how they're struggling. Young children, maybe age 10, start to wet the bed again. There's fear. There's something going wrong. We need to look at the indicators. We need to intervene. We need to find out why changes are happening. And it must be a child-centred system, focusing on making the child safe even before the abuse is proven. And when we get a delay between the family violence court and the family court, we have to fix that. So in my work with Te Puna Aonui, we have I'll just pause that for a moment. We have a children and young people's working group, and we meet together once a month, the NGOs and government agencies, to talk about issues and supporting children. And so I asked this group in the last couple of weeks to what would they like me to say. And so this is from the group Safeguarding Children. Safeguarding Children recommend that the Children's Act 2014 requires any organisation or setting who work with children to have safeguarding policies and safe recruitment practices of staff, contractors and volunteers, to embed child safe standards in legislation. And they point to Queensland that's recently passed the Child Safe Organisations Bill. And that has the framework of accountability and safety across all the organisations involved with children. They say that Aotearoa New Zealand urgently needs a national strategy to prevent all forms of child abuse in all settings, and that we don't currently have one. And that we need mandatory safeguarding and child protection training. And finally, I asked my group that sent me the 4-hour mokopuna report that has been formed by an expert advisory group on children and young people. They have 7 recommendations, and I'm just going to speak to 2 of them, and this is my last slide, and then I'll be asking the Chief Children's Commissioner to speak to us. So 2 of the recommendations are to introduce family violence and sexual violence training for all professionals working with children and young people through best practice guidelines and training across government agencies, and to ensure an independent review of the impacts on children and young people in the New Zealand judicial system, including criminal, youth and family courts, include how the judicial system responds to these populations and in particular their safety needs. So these are just some of the ideas that some groups have come up with. This is not the entire solution, and I'd just like to thank all of you for coming here to help us make some movement in this kaupapa and get the prevention that we all want, get the joined up services that we all want, get the joined up vision that we all want. And Judge Walker, I'll give the last moment to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for contributing to this and being open to the conversation, which, as I say, is just starting. I don't intend this to be done and dusted today. This is very much the start. So I want to thank you for being part of that, and I suppose by your attendance and comments validating that this is an issue worth pursuing. Thank you to my fellow panellists for your time and effort and advice and expertise. Thank you to Anna Burnett, our Centre Manager, for all of the work which you've done to draw all this together. It can't happen without that sort of organisation. And thank you to the Michael and Suzanne Boren Foundation, which is such an important part of the centre. So thank you for that ongoing support. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll be in touch.